In October 1914, Venustiano Carranza, first chief of the Constitutionalist Army and provisional president of Mexico, announced the reorganization of his diplomatic and consular services in the United States. One of Carranza's most important consular appointments was a fellow Coahuilan, Andres G. Garcia, as Constitutionalist representative in El Paso, Texas. During the next 5 years, Garcia emerged as the most important and trusted Carrancista representative on the U.S.-Mexico border. From his post in the strategically situated city, Garcia not only served as Carranza's most visible spokesman, but also oversaw an extensive enterprise of espionage and propaganda dedicated to defending the first chief and the Constitutionalist movement. El Paso was unmatched as a center of international intrigue. Historians Charles Harris and Louis Sadler have likened the city to West Berlin at the height of the Cold War, with more than its share of agents, double and triple agents, mercenaries, gun runners, and propagandists. Stephen Pinckney, special agent of the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Investigation, reported that, quote, every faction is represented in El Paso, each having scores of informants and detectives keeping tabs on the others. There is more double-dealing going on than in any other place on the globe. The juntas of the various factions hold their meetings in El Paso and direct their operations from this side. He complained that it was impossible for a single agent to secure the border and noted that even if the government assigned a dozen federal agents to the city, 12. They could not prevent all the violations of U.S. neutrality laws, arms smuggling, and other illegal activities. Given such circumstances, Venustiano Carranza obviously did not place Garcia in El Paso merely to issue visas and oversee mundane commercial transactions. He needed an operative of proven ability and absolute trust to defend his interests along the border, and Garcia possessed the desired requirements. Consular regulations limited Garcia's formal duties to encouraging commerce, promoting friendly international relations, and assisting Mexican citizens. Revolutionary conditions since the days of Porfirio Diaz, however, had transformed Mexican consular agents into key components of a binational network of clandestine operations. Garcia built his own propaganda and intelligence organizations and dispersed thousands of dollars, suggestively designated as gastos secretos, secret expenses, in the budget of the Foreign Office. He cultivated friendly relations with the El Paso Herald, representatives of the international wire services, and local journalists, and spent hundreds of dollars a month to subsidize friendly Spanish-language newspapers such as Fernando Gamio Pichi's El Paso del Norte. Garcia also carefully constructed an intelligence network comprised of consular detectives, deep cover secret agents, and dozens of informants on both sides of the border, particularly in Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahuita, South El Paso's burgeoning Mexican barrio. These contacts included Mexican hotel clerks, maids, bartenders, prostitutes, transients, migrant workers, deserters, and refugees. He also counted numerous Anglo and Chicano journalists, telegraphers, police officials, customs officers, and military personnel among his intelligence assets. These sources enabled him to keep apprised of enemy conspiracies, military maneuvers, and diplomatic strategies. They also helped him to assess U.S. governmental policies and gauge public opinion. Garcia's deep cover operatives included 3 Mexicans who called themselves Equis, Hash, and Dormilonas, and a gringo known only as Don. His top agent was apparently Canuto Reyes Vasquez, codename Equis, a Carrancista mole who had penetrated the Villista organization in El Paso. Equis was a 25-year-old ex-Villista officer from Parras, Coahuila, who now worked at the American Smelting and Refining Company, Asarco, the smelter in El Paso. He had served in Pancho Villa's División del Norte and was a close acquaintance of Villa's brother Hipolito. Known as El Chino, Equis also acted as private secretary for former General Macrino Martinez, head of the Villista junta in El Paso. Thus, Equis was intimately acquainted with all the leading Villistas, deeply involved in their affairs, and enjoyed access to their most secret discussions and confidential documents. In January 1917, Equis and Garcia executed one of their most spectacular intelligence coups. While Pershing's punitive expedition was still chasing Pancho Villa in Chihuahua, Equis helped acquire a letter written by Charles H. Hunt, addressed to Pancho Villa and entrusted to Dario Silva, a member of the Villista junta in El Paso and Villa's former private secretary. Hunt was a cattle dealer with extensive interests in Mexico and a close associate of Senator Albert B. Fall of New Mexico, a leading spokesman for U.S. business interests in Mexico, and a rabid anti-Carrancista. After having discussed the matter with Fall, Hunt offered to arrange a meeting between the senator and Villa at a place of the latter's choosing. He assured Villa that, quote, Senator Fall is bitterly against Carranza and all his methods, regarding him as a tyrant dragging down the Mexican nation and people into the depth of misery and ruin and disgracing them before the world. Fall and his associates offered Pancho Villa financial and political assistance to protect U.S. property interests in Chihuahua, continue his armed struggle against Carranza, and establish a stable government in Mexico. As historian Friedrich Katz points out, Fall essentially intended that Villa divide Mexico and create a separate republic comprised of the states of Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Nuevo León, as well as Tamaulipas and northern Veracruz, which held most of Mexico's rich petroleum deposits. Publication of this letter in the New York Times, however, exposed and foiled the senator's scheme. And that is from an article entitled Andres G. Garcia, Venustiano Carranza's Eyes, Ears, and Voice on the Border, from Michael M. Smith of Oklahoma State University, published in the Journal of Mexican Studies, Volume 23, Issue 2, in 2007. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
And welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I'm joined by Joshua Treviño, our Chief of Intelligence and Research. Thank you, Josh, for reading that passage. I am sure you're winded because that was a very long passage.
It was a long one. Yes, sorry.
But I wanted to give you the opportunity to unpack it for our listeners and tell us why you chose it.
It's such an interesting passage, and it was really hard. It's actually a 33-page article, so I cut a lot. And actually, I cut the part that I personally was most interested in, which referred to Carrancista complicity in the 1915 Plan de San Diego, which, of course, was the Mexican basically plan to instigate a race war in South Texas, exterminating the Anglos and reclaiming Texas and the rest of the southwestern states for Mexico. But it's so interesting to me because, what we see in this one episode, and Andres Garcia is a figure I didn't know about before reading this article, but this consular official, and what he had to do in terms of advancing the interests of his particular faction in Mexico during the era of the Mexican Revolution. And you've got almost the whole shebang. You've got covert operations inside the United States. You've got monitoring and influence on American public opinion and policy. You have the Americans, various Americans doing the same. And it made me think, actually, of a paper that one of our colleagues, one of your colleagues and mine, just wrote on Grayson Gee, who works here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation with us, wrote a paper on Mexican election interference in the United States. Have you had an opportunity to read this paper?
Yeah. Of course.
Well,
edited it a couple times.
Oh, you edited it a couple times. Well, mea culpa. Then that's why it's so good.
Yeah.
Well, tell me. Tell us a little bit about it, and we can.
It's actually amazing that we had it out. I know it's something that you and I have talked about a lot, even on this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But it's exciting that it's come out this fast, and it's like a very succinct way to show how the current president of Mexico, López Obrador, has consistently threatened that he is going to interfere with how not just Mexicans, but Hispanics vote in the upcoming U.S. elections because of some of the rhetoric that some of those candidates have had when it comes to immigration, illegal immigration specifically.
Yeah.
And so the paper pretty much summarizes those statements. It's a really great paper. I suggest that everybody read it.
Everybody should read it, and they should understand really the kind of the impunity with which Mexican officialdom sees itself as operating in.
Yeah.
Not unreasonably, by the way, because nothing whatsoever ever happens to them when they do this. But as the paper lays out, and it is a very short paper. It's a short, tight monograph. That lays out how the president of Mexico, AMLO, the former essentially foreign secretary, Marcelo Ebrard, all said and encouraged U.S. citizens of Hispanic descent to throw their vote one way or the other in U.S. elections, which is pretty extraordinary. Mexican politicking on U.S. soil is nothing new. There's a significant number of Mexican nationals in the United States, obviously, and they vote in Mexican elections. And so you've seen, at least for the past 20 years, 25 years that I've been paying attention, Mexican presidential candidates, for example, will routinely come to the United States and they'll hold campaign rallies in Los Angeles and places like that. And that's, I would put that in quotes, but that's fairly normal. In Laredo, you and I probably talked about this before. There's Morena posters in Laredo, exhorting people to support AMLO. What's new about really the situation in the past 2 years is this effort by Mexican office holders not just to exert influence on Mexican nationals in the U.S. and their votes in Mexican elections, but attempts to exert influence on U.S. nationals of Mexican descent, of Hispanic descent, in the United States.
Not just Mexican descent. Any
not
Latin
just Mexican
American,
descent, any Hispanic,
including me,
including you.
Of
Yes, of course, with your deep ties to Mexican party officialdom. To sway their vote within the Republican primary, within the general election, and so on. Even as recently, this is not in the paper, but even as recently as I think last week, AMLO got up there and very smugly claimed credit for Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida and his struggles in Republican primary polling, saying that basically taking credit for it, saying that as soon as we exposed his anti-immigrant rhetoric, he started to fall. And so there's this real belief. It's quite dangerous, actually. There's this real belief among Mexican officialdom that they can do this, that there's not going to be a penalty for it, and that they themselves are sort of dispositive players in U.S. elections. Now, set aside the fact that this is illegal. It's prudentially foolish, and one would hope, without a lot of expectation, unfortunately, one would hope that, particularly for the Biden regime, which has made such great hay over protecting elections, safeguarding the integrity of a democratic process. There's a guy recently who was sentenced, I think, to seven months in federal prison because he posted a joke about Hillary Clinton in the on Twitter in the 2016 cycle, and now he's supposedly debasing our elections. I'll tell you the joke that he told too. He basically said that you could text in your vote. It's kind of like the stupid thing.
Wait, did he actually go to prison for that?
He's in prison right now for it. He was sentenced within the past several days. I believe his name is Douglas Mackey. I'll have to double check that.
I didn't know about this.
No. It's actually pretty important. He's being made an example of. It's what's happening. Look, I told that joke too. I got up in front of my then MBA class and said that this is a dumb joke, by the way. I'm not saying it's a funny joke, because one of the oldest election jokes in the book. But Republicans are all going to vote on Tuesday. Democrats will vote on Wednesday. So just make sure you vote at the same time. Like that's the joke. So you don't know when election day is. And so that was the type of joke that he told, and now he's in jail for it. And so all of which is to say, I mean, this is not an election podcast, but with DOJ prosecuting folks like that, you would think that they would be very alert to a neighboring foreign power, and the president and the secretary of external relations of that foreign power actually coming to the United States in the case of Ebrard and telling U.S. nationals that they need to vote this way or that, and it's incredible. And what uniformly provokes it is either a U.S. office holder will criticize the Mexican state on its actions or lack thereof against illegal immigration, which is entirely just, or they'll note that the Mexican state has a real problem with criminal cartels, which it absolutely does. Yeah. And of course that generates a reaction that's a tell from them. But in any case, we published a paper on it. Those of you listening should go. Yeah, thank you. We'll link it in the description, but you all should read it. But that's one of the reasons I picked this piece to really illuminate kind of the historic connection and intertwinedness. I don't even know if that's a word of politics and interest in both the United States and Mexico.
Well, that's a great start. Thank you, Josh, for picking that.
Yeah.
And I also want to start the podcast by, sharing a very exciting announcement with all of our listeners. I think last week when we were filming on Tuesday, that was the day that the governor announced that he was calling the 4th special session on the same day that the 3rd special ended. And we found out that border security was on the call. So we announced it, I think, while we were live recording our last podcast.
Yes.
But at the time, we didn't know. We didn't know very much. We didn't know what bills would be filed. But then the next day we started finding out, and then we started preparing. We started preparing to testify. Mm-hmm. And so there were 2 pieces of border security legislation that would help us secure more funding for border barrier infrastructure, and that would help us rein in some of the lawlessness that we've inherited from our federal government at the border.
Yeah.
And those are those were SB3 and SB4, or HB3 and HB4 with their identical companions in the Senate.
Right. Texas SB3 and SB4.
Exactly,
Yeah, right.
yes, here in Texas. So Senate Bill 3 provides additional funding, like I said, for border barrier infrastructure, and then as well as some funding for the public safety in the Colony Ridge development in Liberty County, which, as we know,
Right.
is being just overrun with illegal immigration. And then we have Senate Bill 4, which I know that we've both testified on in some form or fashion in a
have.
different session, in a
Yes.
different special session, or you in the regular session as well. But it creates a new state offense for entering or re-entering Texas illegally from a foreign nation.
Correct.
And so only 2 days after the start of the special session on Thursday, which I think is the day that I testified, both were quickly moved out of the Senate and sent to the House. And just 2 nights ago, so not last night, but the night before, the Texas House passed both of them, which is very good news, and we're very excited about it. So SB3 has been amended, and it's going to go back to the Senate. But SB4 is now headed to Governor Greg Abbott's desk, and he has
Yes.
said that he intends to sign the proposal into law. So that's great news for all of our listeners. We're very grateful for all the leadership for making this happen.
Yeah, and SB4 headed to the governor's desk still contains the deportation provision, doesn't it?
It's a removal provision.
It's a removal,
not
I'm sorry.
Deportation,
Removal,
but
yes. They can be ordered to remove, but the
yes.
state of Texas cannot actually conduct the removal. Is that
no,
right?
no.
Yes.
And it's changed a little bit. The former bill that we had that passed the House the last special session, so the third called special session, allowed police officers to make that call. So police officers or any peace officer would be able to
And now it's a magistrate.
detain, and now it would have to go to a judge or a magistrate.
Right. Okay.
So that's how it passed. But yeah, we're excited about it. I think any bill that we have that would create that additional deterrence that right now is unfortunately not there is something that's positive
Absolutely.
for our state. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to say, I know this is something that, we've been working on for a long time, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to say something about SB4. I know that we've been getting a lot of questions and a lot of people that are concerned because it's being distorted a lot by the media and some advocacy groups that think that this will allow people to be deported en masse, and that it will cause some racial profiling. So
Right.
I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Big issues. First of all, with the passage of SB4 headed to the governor's desk, and obviously SB3's got to go back to the House, I believe. Is that right?
Back to the Senate.
Back to the Senate. I apologize.
Yes.
Well, I want to congratulate you and your fellow policy director, Selena Rodriguez, and the campaign chief, Karina Martinez, because the three of you on the Texas Public Policy Foundation end have been the ones at the tip of the spear, kind of in informing and helping and aiding and supporting the passage of this. So well done.
Thank
You're not new to, you personally, Melissa, are not new to the world of policy and politics at all. You served in the White House, done a lot of things, but I would say you're relatively new in the Texas sphere.
Yes.
And so you have, in year one, you have led the way on transformative legislation. So well done.
Thank you.
That's quite a record of achievement. Look, SB4 is well, I'll talk about that because I know it best, and I also think that SB4 is actually the most transformative of the two bills. Not that 3 is small potatoes, because it's not. But to do what Texas Senate Bill 4 in the fourth called special session of the 88th legislature, Texas legislature does, which is create a misdemeanor escalating to a felony for illegal entry into Texas, and then allowing a magistrate to order removal of that person from Texas, is absolutely extraordinary. Fully constitutional, by the by. That's something that we at the foundation have talked about, and you and I have talked about personally from the start. But we have to take a moment to appreciate just how strong a measure this is. And but as we appreciate how strong it is, we also have to understand that it is not radical, it's not extra constitutional, nor is it even unprecedented. The past century, this has been one of the topics on this podcast. The past century has seen essentially state powers and the understanding of state powers under the Constitution atrophy. And it's atrophied for two big reasons. One is that states just haven't had to think about a lot of the things that we used to think about. Texas and the Texas-Mexico border were scenes of endemic warfare, essentially from the day of creation all the way through the early 1920s, and they haven't been for a century, and so we've forgotten. we collectively have forgotten a lot of the policy reflexes and options that we've had for dealing with that. SB4 gets us back to a full exercise of those powers. The other reason, of course, is that the relationship between the states and the federal government has changed as the progressive vision of the administrative state has advanced further and further, with the ultimate aim of reducing states to essentially administrative units. And thank goodness Texas is pushing back on that. So I'm very excited about it. I think the fact that Texas gets to, under this law, adjudicate who's there, and with the magistrate's approval, actually order the removal from Texas territory is politically transformative. Now, the proof is in the application. I would guess, and I don't have any inside information on this, that it is almost inevitable that the U.S. Department of Justice files a lawsuit to prevent implementation of this law. That'd be my guess. As soon as it's signed, you're going to hear something. And one of the reasons I think that is that the Mexicans are already protesting it.
Yeah.
And we know why they're protesting it. Shutting down the human trafficking and the remittances flow is a direct strike at the one thing that the Mexican state cares about, which is not the welfare of its citizens. It's not the justice of anything happening on the border. It's money. And so SB4 and its implementation will affect the flow of money, and that's something that they care about. We also know that the DOJ is going to respond, our DOJ is going to respond to whatever the Mexicans ask, because they believe that the Mexicans have them over a barrel during the election year in 2024. I think I might have just interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. You're totally good. I was going to read you the Mexican government's reaction
by all means,
a little
yes,
bit so
please.
you could comment on it.
Thank you.
What you said, everything is absolutely correct. And there's nothing radical, there's nothing unjust about ordering someone that's here illegally to return to where they came from.
Correct.
And I think that's something a lot of people don't seem to understand. But I wanted to tell you about the Mexican government's reaction. Mexico has rejected SB4, saying that it will violate the human rights of Mexican immigrants in Texas. And the statement of Alicia Barcena, Mexico's Secretary for Foreign Relations, she said, the government of Mexico reiterates its rejection of any measure that contemplates the involuntary return of migrants without respect for due process. Mexico recognizes the sovereign right of any country to decide the public policies that should be implemented in its territory. But Mexico also has a right to defend the estimated 10 million people of Mexican origin in Texas and establish its own immigration policies in its territory. So anyway.
Well, that's all very well and good for them to say. And I'm glad SRE and Morena and the Mexican state, who are routinely silent when trafficked migrants are massacred by the dozen, beheaded, raped, thrown into pits to die, their children sold in slave markets. They don't ever issue a statement then, but they do issue a statement when Texas decides to defend itself. I'll be candid with you. It simply increases my and I think any rational person's disdain and disgust for this apparatus on the south side of the border that regards the lives of its own fellow men with such it places such a low value on them. What they're interested in is keeping the traffic flowing because it keeps the money flowing. 100%. End of story. That's what they want, and that's why they're protesting. That's why they say they reject a Texas law, and that it's in their power to do so. The tragedy of it, of course, is that Washington, D.C. and the Biden regime are 100% going to do what the Mexicans ask of them. Because no doubt. We've seen it before, right? No, we've seen them. We've seen the federal agents go and wreck Texas border infrastructure. We've actually, there's video out there of watching federal agents actually lift and cut wire so that illegal migrants can enter Texas.
Now they're using a tractor, so
now
they
they're
don't
using
have to cut
tractors
it.
to do it. Yeah, so they don't even have to cut it, and nobody needs to get their hands dirty. Texas, I think it's worth repeating something that we've said before on this podcast. Texas is fighting two regimes. We're fighting the regime in Mexico City, but we're also fighting the regime in Washington D.C. And they have made common cause with one another against Texas. So this legislation is fantastic. It's epical. There's one aspect of it that you mentioned that I haven't addressed yet, which I will now. But it's not the end. There's also going to be implementation, and there's probably also going to be litigation to it. And I cannot understate the extent to which that litigation and that fight that's coming is literally existential. do we rule ourselves? Do we have a right to preserve our communities? Do we have a right to decide who is and who isn't our neighbor? These are fundamental questions at stake, and I would encourage the listener here to understand them as such. Now, you raised the issue of racial profiling, which I think is important. There is a train of thought. I mean, how would I even describe this? A train of thought, a rhetorical line. You and I have both, at various points, you much more recently than me, have been testifying in favor of these bills. So what was, I should say, by way of setting this up, you were the only voice in favor of this bill for 4. When public testimony came, there were, 20 others who testified against, something like that? Or was it more than that?
The first time in the 3rd special session, yes. The second time, I actually was the first to testify, and I didn't stick around for all the others. But I know there was a huge call to action, so there was going to be a lot.
What does everybody say? What does everybody who's against it, what do they always say?
It's unfair, it's inhumane, it's racist, please don't be racist. I have Hispanic friends, and I don't want to see them be kicked out of our country. And then you see very, bright legal minds just coming up and saying it's wrong, it's unconstitutional, we can't do this.
Right.
And that is just repeatedly what we hear. Yeah. And then one person that just said, I beg you, please don't pass this bill.
So it's racist.
It's racist. It's inhumane.
It's and Hispanics and brown people are going to be kicked out of the country. They're going to be terrorized.
It's going to disproportionately affect Black and brown people.
Now, not to put you on the spot, but you're Bolivian American. Your husband, who is one of my favorite soccer guys, is also Bolivian. Are either of you concerned that SB4 is going to get you kicked out of the country?
No.
Tell me why. Because the left tells me that you should be afraid of this.
Well, first of all, we're here legally, so we're not.
Imagine that.
Yeah, we're not scared. Especially, my husband waited 6 years in Bolivia before he got to set foot here, and so I think especially people like my husband and my husband's family who have waited so long and worked so hard and paid lawyers so much money and done it the right way to come here are especially outraged by the crisis that's going on right now.
And so I guess not to put words in his mouth or yours, but is it fair to say there's a sentiment in favor of measures like this, which hold people to account?
Absolutely, especially if you care. If you care about your fellow Latinos and Mexicans and Hispanics, if you care about them, then you would want some sort of deterrent there in place so that we can have a more organized system for people to come in legally.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, you're not driving them through to the grasp of the cartels or pushing them to come here in a way that's very dangerous and unsafe between ports of entry. We all know what happens at the border.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you're just looking for basic humanity, shutting down the trafficking is the most humane thing you can do, right? So I think this all gets to kind of the big point. This is the refutation of what our friends on the left are saying, and as is typically the case, they really have no argument other than there's racial iniquity and this is racist and this and that. It is nearly impossible to imagine. Anything can happen within the contingency of human history, but it is impossible to imagine. I shouldn't even say nearly. It's impossible to imagine that SB4 or anything like it is going to result in a reign of terror against Texas Hispanics, people who look Mexican. I mean, whatever that means. I am Mexican. I don't look. People don't think I look Mexican, but I am. That they're going to be rounded up and sent back to Mexico. This is the way in which the law is structured is such that mere illegal presence is not what the law says. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's actually a legal entry.
Yes, from a foreign nation.
It's from a legal entry from a foreign nation. So there has to be that extra that extra element of action to it, and then a magistrate obviously is going to. So it's not the individual discretion of a peace officer on the ground. But there's a magistrate who has to be persuaded of this case, right? So there's a series of, and then of course there's provisions for identity verification in the bill. Actually, that was something that when the fourth special opened, that both chambers made sure that was in there.
Yeah.
And so it is simply unrealistic to conclude that there's going to be kind of a mass roundup of individuals. That I should note that has happened in American history. There was under the Hoover administration there was a policy called Mexican repatriation, which actually cleared out a great deal of the Southwest of anyone who was Mexican or Mexican American.
That was during the Great Depression, right?
During the Great Depression, yeah, that's exactly right. And the intent was, it was actually a disastrous policy, and so that particular policy, because it was indiscriminate and it was essentially aimed at eradicating entire communities, which is absolutely not the case here. I mean, there's no constituency for that. Even if there was, it would be immoral and illegal, so you couldn't do it. But that actually did push American citizens of Mexican descent into Mexico at the time. Interestingly enough, the thesis behind it was that if you got rid of the Mexican population, you would decrease unemployment because there would be a labor shortage, and then what ended up actually happening was that they shrank the economy, and so the depression got worse in the areas that that happened. Anyway, a bit of a historical footnote, all of which is to say that the barest charity that I can extend to a lot of our friends on the left who are critics of SB4 is that there's some historical precedent for their fears. You have to go back almost 90 years to get to it, but it's there. But the reality is that when you look at the bill, when you look at how it's structured, also, when you look at the nature of law enforcement in South Texas, heavily Hispanic, heavily Mexican American, there's just no grounds for thinking that there's going to be anything like what they predict. What my guess is that what you're going to see is because the trafficked individuals and the migrants and the traffickers themselves are exceptionally well informed as to the nature of policy on the north side of the border, they're going to know that Texas is probably not a place you want to cross because you will not, like the old regime where even if state law enforcement caught you, they turned you over to the feds, and the feds are definitely going to let you go. That's over. And these are rational incentive people, and it's going to change behavior, hopefully for the good.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you one thing I'm very curious about is what's going to happen if Mexico refuses to accept the migrants that are being removed because of SB4? Because as you know, a lot of them are not from Mexico. A lot of them are other foreign nationals. We've talked about this before. It's like a little UN. They have people from, Central and Latin America, Canada, Asia, Europe, Africa. Actually, in fiscal year 2023, this number was actually very surprising to me. But fiscal year 2023 ended on September 30th. But 83% of the 1 million immigrants encountered by Border Patrol at the Texas-Mexico border were not Mexican citizens. So, I know that Mexico has agreements in place with the U.S. government to accept Mexican citizens and then some people from other countries when they are deported from the U.S., but it would be very unprecedented for Mexico to create some sort of diplomatic relationship with a U.S. state over immigration. And so I'm just curious, how do you see that playing out?
The Mexicans will do it if they perceive it as in their interest to do so. If I don't have a crystal ball here. My guess is that probably concurrent with whatever litigation is brought by the U.S. Department of Justice against Texas, the Mexicans will, quite plausibly decide that they're not going to take anybody. And if they decide not to, then we can't force them to. It's beyond our power. And so, but the law provides for criminal penalties, misdemeanors escalating to felonies, depending on what it is, and so those individuals will then be subject to justice at, in the state of Texas, and then so be it. That's and then presumably. Once that's served, whatever that looks like, then they get remanded into federal custody, and at that point, the record there is not robust. But I think focusing on that is important. We have to understand why what's going to happen is happening, but we can't miss. I'm not pushing back against you at all, by the way, Melissa. But we can't miss, even if the Mexicans accept no people remanded across the border ever, the political point that's being made is tremendously important, which is that states have this power to protect their citizenry. And that is existentially important at this juncture in history.
No, and the situation right now at the border absolutely calls for some sort of a solution. We just got the new numbers for October, and although there's a very slight decrease from September, it's still so high. I mean, there was over 240,000 people encountered at the border.
Encounters, yeah.
Yeah, and then I also just saw this report that was released by the House Committee on Homeland Security a couple of days ago, since we're talking about the border. But this it's like a very long, it's a 49-page report, but it shows some numbers that were very alarming. It found that the southern border crisis has cost American taxpayers around 451 billion
Yeah.
per year for services that have been provided to a record number of illegal aliens under the Biden administration. So this is, money that's being lost on law enforcement, education, housing, healthcare, which is a huge cost in other sectors, but it takes into account the millions of illegal immigrants that are being released by DHS and also the, as we know, 1.7 million known gotaways that we've had at our southern border.
Yeah.
And so, as we know, like only a very tiny fraction of all of this money is ever recouped by the taxes that are paid by illegal aliens. So the rest is going to fall on the shoulders of American citizens, lawful residents, American businesses, federal and state governments.
Yeah.
So that just blew my mind. That's a very big number. I can't even fathom how much it is.
Sorry, it's over 200,000 just in the past month? Encounters?
240.
240,000 in the past month.
That's the month of October, and that is the highest number ever for an October.
And that's just encounters. I mean, again, we say this every time, but
small...
if you go by the rule of thumb that you only encounter 20% of the people who are actually crossing, that blows past 1 million. Just for the month of October, who've entered the United States.
And as we know, like the Biden administration has failed to remove like 99% of the illegal immigrants that have been released here in the U.S.
That's
and
right.
So we're getting a massive influx. And I kind of wanted to use that to ask you about an article that you sent me. I know we're a 501c3, we don't endorse candidates, but we are allowed to talk about their policies and about their proposals. So I wanted to bring up one Republican contender that I used to work for,
Okay. All right.
our former president, Donald Trump. He said that if he regains power, he wants not only to revive some of his old immigration policies that have been heavily criticized by a lot of people during his presidency, but that he actually wants to expand and toughen them if he becomes our next president.
Yeah.
So, he's talked about deportations, bringing back something like Title 42, but making it a little bit more broad so it can stick around.
Sure.
He's even talked about revoking, like very specific things, like revoking the visas of some of the foreign students, the international students that are at the pro-Palestine protests. He wants to end birthright citizenship, revoke TPS, temporary protected status, and a lot of other things. So if essentially he's like ready to unleash all the federal powers of basically an immigration crackdown, like something that we've never seen before in this country. So I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on that.
It wasn't clear to me and maybe I didn't read the article closely enough. I mean, this is in the New York Times, I guess 3 days ago, if I remember correctly, earlier this week as we record. So I don't recall what the sourcing is. So I don't think, I just want to put an asterisk on it. I don't think any of the sourcing for this was from like any official campaign document. But when they contacted Stephen Miller and people like that, like they didn't deny it. They were like, yeah, this is along the lines of our thinking. So let's assume that the reporting is largely accurate. I think there's a lot of really popular stuff in there, and largely there are a few elements that, like from a prudential standpoint, I would dissent from. I mean, I happen to think birthright citizenship's been a net positive for the country, under the prevailing understanding of the 14th Amendment. But I wouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If the president or the future president, be that as it may, we're not predicting here, but let's say Donald Trump does become president again in January 2025, what you see there outlined in the New York Times is, in candor, an overwhelmingly good policy. In terms of bringing accountability to a broken border, to reforming how immigration is adjudicated in the United States, and also by imposing real penalties in the form of removal for illegal entry, for violation of terms of visas. You talked about a lot of the pro-Palestine students. We should be clear. I want to use a different phrase: pro-Hamas students. The extent to which we have found in the past 5 weeks now, since the atrocities, the massacres on October 7th in Israel, that our academic institutions harbor a real legit pro-terrorist elements within them. Any single foreign national, who holds a student visa, under a regime that was even slightly interested in the self-preservation of the United States, should be gone by now. You shouldn't be able to keep your student visa. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology just last week, in the past week, essentially admitted that when they had incidents on their campus of foreign students, against student visa holders, terrorizing Jewish students, like something out of the Third Reich, right? They didn't discipline them because they didn't want to lead to a process where these kids would lose their student visas. Ridiculous. Get them out. Get them out. They don't belong here. They're clearly not consonant with any purpose or intent that we see in education, and they're certainly not good for America, which ought to be the guidepost of any policy that we do. So look, if this is in fact the outline of a future Trump presidency in terms of removing people who are here illegally, controlling the border, and making sure there's policies in place to do it, then that's all for the good. We cannot forget that the only time in the past 25 years that any kind of sanity has reigned on our southern border was during the Trump administration. And how did he get it? He got it by threatening the Mexican economy. He got it by threatening tariffs that would have severely hurt the one thing that regime cares about, which is the flow of money. And then suddenly we got the Remain in Mexico policy. We got a border that was if not all the way there, reasonably under control, certainly compared to what we have now. And if this kind of thing gets us back to that, which it might. You and I have talked to a lot of the same Mexicans, and a lot of them say we need the mano duro from the Americans. We need the strong hand.
Yeah.
This seems pretty mano duro to me.
Yeah. And back then we had a little respect from Mexico. So
yeah. Well, yeah. You've got to demand it.
Yeah.
And you've got to show that you deserve it. And right now, they quite rightly believe that we don't deserve it. And unfortunately, we've got to prove otherwise.
Well, we'll continue to update our listeners on what happens on that end. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about how a couple of days ago they cleaned up San Francisco. And all it took was a dictator from China to get it done.
Yes.
And so I wanted to ask you, okay, so President Biden and China announced that they have agreed to work together on fentanyl, where China will crack down on some of the precursors and chemicals that for that. And in exchange, the U.S. has said that they will allow some of their organizations to have access to U.S. technology again. So I wanted to get your perspective. Do you think this is going to make a difference as far as the fentanyl crisis here? Will we notice the things from this deal here in the U.S.?
No, it's not going to make a difference at the fentanyl crisis. The only lasting, there's only going to be two lasting results from Chairman Xi's visit to the United States. One is that the Chinese are going to get expanded access to U.S. technology in markets which frankly they're going to put to poor use, and the other is that San Francisco is going to be clean for a little while, and that's really it. The idea that you can put any trust into the PRC or the Chinese Communist apparatus at this late stage is preposterous, and frankly, the Biden team is grasping at straws to think it's at all possible. But look, there's one thing that we need to understand that actually links back to our topic, which is the subject of the show on the U.S.-Mexico border and Mexican affairs. When we see San Francisco, which descended into filth and crime. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Over several years, when you see it abruptly cleaned up for the Chinese dictator, you have to know that the priorities of the regime that controls the city of San Francisco, in this case, probably the city government and Governor Gavin Newsom and his people, they don't really govern in the interests, and they don't work for the people that they actually rule. I mean, they don't. Don't Americans deserve to have clean and safe cities? Well, apparently not.
I guess not. Yeah.
But the dictator of China does. And that mindset exists vis-a-vis the Mexican state as well, which is again why I probably sound like a broken record, but it's worth repeating over and over. Which is why you see the federal government intervening on Mexico's behalf against Texas so very often.
Yeah, and I found it so funny, the research that you find sometimes when you're when you're like trying to prepare for a podcast. But I was doing a little bit of research trying to prepare for this, and I found this speech that President Biden gave before he was president. It was August 2020. Actually, as he was accepting the Democratic Party's nomination for president. And this is a quote. He said, "I'll be a president who will stand with our allies and friends and make it clear to our adversaries the days of cozying up to dictators is over." And I just found that fascinating because obviously, like last week when we were filming our live recording of Hard Country, we talked about how he's been willing to cooperate with Venezuela. And now this week, we have seen him literally rolling out a red carpet for the Chinese dictator after he said that he will not cozy up to dictators. And then the next day he said, yeah, I stand by what I said before, like he is a dictator. Yeah. But he's sitting in an audience and smiling and listening to this 30-minute speech by the dictator in China who's talking about how, what did he say? The enduring friendship between China and the United States that will not be diminished by recent turmoil. And he compared our relationship, the U.S.'s relationship with China, to a giant ship that was trying to navigate through storms.
How charming. How charming! Yeah, no, that was Biden's big thing. I mean, look, President Biden is famous in D.C. for getting almost every issue wrong. Like he managed to be, especially with regard to foreign affairs, he managed to be on the wrong side of absolutely everything. And so he was wrong about this too. In mid 2020, he was talking about the U.S. is basically going to adopt this Jimmy Carter-esque policy of only engaging with fellow liberal Democrats, small d Democrats abroad. And insulting the Saudi. It's unclear to me if MBS is king or not. But I don't really pay attention to Saudi affairs. But the Saudi autocrat, dictator, let's use the word, saying he was going to make him a pariah. And every time he's done that, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, China, to your point, in the past almost 3 years now since almost 3 years since he was inaugurated. He comes crawling back. He has to reverse himself eventually because he just doesn't really understand how the levers of power work internationally. And anyway, the man's in over his depth, and so is his team. We have to understand that for all the criticism we level at the president, there ought to be a team of competent men about him to guide him. But people like Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Blinken and so on are completely unequipped to handle, Western hemispheric affairs, set aside what's going on in East Asia. So it's unfortunate, but it's true.
More people need to be held accountable for that. And, speaking of San Francisco, the president of Mexico has also met with Xi Jinping. And they talked. The Chinese president applauded the cooperation that they've had with Mexico on rail, auto, energy, cooperation on infrastructure, on finance, EVs. And then, he also offered condolences for the hurricane tragedy that Mexico had and said that they will be happy to assist. And then AMLO thanked him for his help with the pandemic for offering to help with Hurricane Otis, and said that they're very friendly with China and will continue to work very closely to combat the drug production, which doesn't give me much confidence. But I wanted to, tell you that. And then I also wanted to talk about one more thing. I don't know if we have a lot of time before we wrap, but I wanted to talk to you about some of the politics that there's been behind Mexico's recent Hurricane Otis, and how badly the government of Mexico's emergency response, how bad it was to that, and how badly they failed the storm's victims.
The destruction of Acapulco and kind of the surrounding areas in coastal Guerrero by this Cat 5 hurricane.
It's been a while. It was October 25th.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I mean, it's been made so much worse by the government response or the absence thereof.
Yeah.
AMLO. I guess in the past 2 years, kind of gutted this emergency fund that the Mexican state. I'm sorry, what is it?
Fonden? Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Well then, yes. That was supposed to be in reserve for cases like this, and as with every pile of cash that he doesn't personally control, he wanted it eliminated so he could move it to something that he does control, which he did, and then there was nothing available to help. I can say on a personal level, I've seen what a Cat 5 hurricane can do. I was part of the Army's relief expedition to Central America after Hurricane Mitch in late 1998, And I'll never forget. I mean, we saw a lot of devastation, washed out bridges, and there was a riverbed that we ended up building a bridge over. My engineer platoon that apparently used to have a village on the side of it, and it was just swept away. So I mean, horrific. But we were I'll have to look up the name of the volcano, but we flew into Managua. We went to Puerto Corinto, I believe, and then ended up driving halfway to where we spent the next several months working, which was kind of north of Esteli up in the highlands. And in the morning, because we bivouacked in this field, and in the morning, kind of the sun rises and you're getting ready, and there is a mountain off in the distance, and half of the mountain is basically like this sickly gray. And I'm so sorry. I apologize to the listeners. I'm blanking on what the name of this is, but it's an infamous incident. But the Cat 5 hurricane dumped so much water and wind that essentially the slopes of this I believe it was a dormant volcano. The mountain essentially collapsed on itself and buried hundreds of people in a settlement at the base of it. I mean, it was just awful. And so you look at it, it's like seeing, they call these things acts of God, and you can see why they do it, because just the awesomeness, the terrible awesomeness of the power on display, and knowing that there is underneath this gray slab a town, like Vesuvius is. And so I think about that. And the destruction that we saw in Mitch this is 25 years ago now. And I think about it when we see the news about Acapulco and Guerrero, and they were hit by a Cat 5, also essentially unprepared, also with a state that couldn't really account for itself. Now, in the late 90s, fortunately, like the United States stepped in, and I wouldn't say we were, I don't know, we made things much better, but there was help, in addition to local infrastructure. There's nothing like that in Guerrero. I mean, Lord knows if they invite the Chinese in, they'll just get in debt essentially. Yeah. But what a tragedy! I'm sorry to ramble at length about it. But
no, I'm glad you brought that up, because the videos. It took a while to get some of that, because the hurricane just hit it so hard that for a couple days it cut out all the power. It destroyed homes, beachfront hotels, like turned them into piles of sticks. And it completely flooded all of the streets. So it was incredibly devastating. And what's especially sad about it is, Acapulco was once like world famous, beach city, great like tourist destination, but it had been in a very sharp decline for a while.
Because of cartel violence.
Because of cartel violence. Yeah. Cartel violence basically was already destroying it, and it made it into one of the most dangerous places. It had one of the highest murder rates in the entire world.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that's very sad, but anyways, now it's completely destroyed. And something that is even sadder is Mexico continues to destroy it. So they messed up on a lot of fronts. They apparently were warned about it in advance. Did you know that? The U.S. National Hurricane Center warned them that it was coming, and they just weren't prepared and were caught off guard. Yeah. And then after it happened, all the residents there were pretty much left to fend for themselves. There was claims that people were having to defend their property, with machetes, and defend their families because there were looters coming in. There were thieves trying to steal things, which is absolutely terrible. And, when AMLO was asked about it, I don't know if you saw this video, but when AMLO was asked about it, he kind of chuckled and he said, oh, it's just, it's become a national pastime to talk badly about me. So he, played victim.
Did he really say that?
Basically, yes.
Oh, my gosh.
He said, como que ya se volvió deporte nacional hablar mal del presidente.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And yet too believable with him.
Well, and, it was kind of funny. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a video of him trying to go to Acapulco.
I did see that. And he couldn't make it. He had to turn around.
He couldn't make it. He started walking, and a lot of people were, giving him a hard time because it seemed like it was for the photo op. But he got out of his Jeep that was stuck in the mud, and he started walking, and 2 hours later, people saw him back in Mexico City, and they were like, did you just go for the photos?
It was for the photos, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but the reason I thought it was so interesting is that a lot of people think that the cartels are going to profit enormously from the rebuilding efforts in Acapulco.
I mean, entirely if there are rebuilding efforts, but yeah. I mean, organized crime is going to be part of any large scale expenditure there. Why don't we end on a happy note and talk about food?
Oh yeah, the article
Yeah.
you sent me. It's what's the article called? It's like 25 essential dishes in Mexico
In
City.
Mexico City, it was in the New York Times.
Yeah.
This morning, I think. Was it this morning
I
or
think it was
yesterday?
yesterday.
Yesterday?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so yes, 25. I believe 25 essential restaurants in Mexico City. A good list. I was very proud because I've been to 3 of them. You've been to 9 of them, isn't that
Maybe
right?
8. I
Maybe
haven't
8?
counted, but I recognize a couple of them.
Tell us your favorite from the list, please.
Ooh, okay. Maybe El Cardonal. We were just talking about this, so I'd have to look through the list to remember which ones are good. I'd
Well,
have to look
what's
through it,
so actually
but-
that's my choice too. I mean, of the 3 that I've been to, El Cardinal. I've been to El Cardinal, San Angelin, and Yoshimi.
San Angelin, but San Angelin was in there for their margarita, and they had the most amazing food. So I feel like they deserve to be in there for some of their other food.
I mean, just the grounds of the San Angelin, which is sorry for for those of you who have not been to Mexico City. It's just beautiful. Colonial style.
Incredible.
It's almost like a
an
convent.
hacienda, kind
An
of.
hacienda, yeah, exactly. It's got green grass and nice
Spectacular.
trees and things like that. El Cardinal is my favorite too. Okay, so what's your favorite at El Cardinal though? Tell me. What do you like
Their
about
hot chocolate.
Yeah?
And they had their hot chocolate, and then they have like their huevos divorciados, which
Oh,
is
yeah,
really
yeah.
good
That
for
is really good.
breakfast.
Yeah.
But I've never forgotten their hot chocolate. And you can make it spicy. I remember that my husband did that, and we were just mind blown. We kept going back. But it's my sweet tooth. They're conchas. That's what made it my favorite. But Yoshimi's nice. It's just very swanky. It's not Mexican.
No.
It's Japanese.
Yeah.
And
Food though.
And then obviously San Angelin is amazing for more than the food. Just the place is absolutely spectacular.
My favorite is the same as yours, El Cardinal. Although I don't have. You've got exponentially more restaurants on the list than I do. But it's nice to end with something positive
Yeah.
about Mexico and Mexico City. And I love the conchas.
Yeah.
Because they're a South Texas favorite as well. And what's interesting about the ones at El Cardinal, at least I found, having very familiar with the South Texas version, is that they're much softer, more más suave, I guess. And I'm not sure how they achieve it, but they look exactly the same. But the sugar on the top of the concha just kind of flakes
Yeah.
off, and it's so nice. And you have it with some coffee and the hot chocolate, and it's just perfect.
That sounds amazing.
And
right
especially in the ones, there's multiple El Cardinal locations. I've only
there's a lot.
been to the one that's outside of Parque Alameda, near the Hilton Reforma,
Yeah.
right? And that's the one you've been to as
now.
well.
Yeah, I think it's like in the lobby of the hotel, right?
It's kind of in the
Yeah.
lobby, but you can see, and I love looking out because they've got these tall trees and some jacarandas in Parque Alameda, and we've got the coffee and the concha, and you're sitting there and you're looking out at the park. This park, by the way, is I don't know if you've ever looked at the history of Parque Alameda. It's like 700 years old. It's an Aztec era
amazing.
park that
Yeah.
survived everything into this day, and there's a connection with history and just beauty that I think Mexico City can uniquely provide. So
Yeah. Well, I think there's some research we need to go do in Mexico City soon, right?
probably I would love to be able to focus on the ample positives about Mexico.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you, Melissa.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you so much to all of our listeners, and we'll see you next time.